Have you created a game that the world needs to play, but you've got no idea how to get it out there? Are you baffled by the extensive information online about Kickstarters, publishers, licensing agreements and patents? I would never have got a single game to market, let alone 10, if it wasn't for the friendly advice of generous designers who had been there and done it. In this video, I'm going to pay it forward by providing you with a proven pathway to getting your game to market. My new book, Getting Published, does exactly that. It tells you how to get an idea out of your head and onto store shelves. And it's easier than you think. So this is my fourth book. This is Getting Published, Adam in Wales Getting Published, and it's available now on Amazon. It's quite a big book, this one, because there is a lot of content in here. Okay, this collects together video essays that I've written over the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, extensive number of videos and a whole load of new information in there as well, because I've collected all that information together, reviewed it, made sure it's up to date, and then tried to create a narrative that guides you through the process from coming up with that idea through to actually getting it published. So in this video, I want to show you briefly what's in this book. If we have a look at it compared to my previous books, if we have a look compared to my Board Game Designer journal, this is a more substantial book. There's more pages in here than there are in that one. In fact, there's more pages in here than there were in my book Playtesting. So Getting Published is very much the book that tells you how to do it, how to get your games made by publishers. So it starts off with a chapter on the structure of the industry, so it'll talk you through who the different players are in the industry and how they work and how they're all related to each other. So that's your kind of board game design industry 101. Then moves on to talk about the board game economy, how people in that industry get paid, and more specifically how game designers get paid. What can you expect to receive? We've got a comparison then about crowdfunding versus licensing games, so you can decide which way you'd like to go, looking at the pros and cons of those two different routes to market. Now, I am somebody who has always licensed my games to publishers rather than crowdfunded them, so the bulk of the book does cover licensing rather than crowdfunding. It talks about what publishers want. Okay, in my experience, what are publishers looking for? And in fact, I did talk to some publishers to get some information about what they're currently looking for. How do we research publishers to try and determine which publishers we should be reaching out to? And there are very specific genres that it covers in here which are more challenging to get your game into market. And it talks about why and how you might approach these more challenging sort of things like sports games and word games and games with exceptionally high production values, or collectible card games, you know, the classic things which publishers maybe aren't really looking to publish right now because they're hard to get to market for one reason or another. We've got a chapter then on outdated features. So this is the sort of thing which you might find publishers you know, they ask you some questions. Why is this particular mechanism or feature included in your game? And you're going to have to justify its inclusion, because there are certain things that publishers in the modern era just aren't really looking at right now, even though they might have done, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Okay, times have changed. So we've got a large chapter on that. Then we get on to part 2 of the book. Having set up some ideas about the industry and where we're at the moment, we look at becoming a designer. So there's a whole section on designing your first game, which is sort of a motivational chapter, really, talking about my own experience of designing my first games and the point where I realised that I was a game designer, even though I had never called myself that up to that point. And you'll remember from my previous books, I'm always keen to reinforce to people, you're not an aspiring game designer. If you make games, if you invent games, even if they're just in your head, you are a game designer. Forget the aspiring. You don't need the qualifier. If you're making games, you're a designer. Chapter 8 is about required skills. So this talks about the fact that being a game designer is not just about creating games, but if you're going to make a success of it, you're going to have a whole load of other skills that you're either going to need to learn for yourself, or you're going to have to delegate out to other partners. So one of the skills in there is about collaboration, but there are 10 different skills that I think are really valuable to a board game designer, and they're all listed in here. So it's things like IT, graphic design, organisation, patience, resilience, self-motivation, crafting, and so on. Number 9 is about finding time to design. I'm a part-time board game designer. I know people who do it full-time, but it's perfectly possible to design games professionally alongside your full-time job, as long as you're organised and you have schedules. So I talk here about my goals, the goals that I set for myself, how I approach all of that, and then my schedule that I use through the year, what I'm doing at various different months in order to get to the point where I can pitch games to publishers. Part 3 of the book is about creating the actual game. So there's a section here on prototyping and the difference between a working prototype, a pitching prototype, and an early prototype, because they have very different requirements. And then that leads us into talking about writing rules. So there's an extensive section about how to lay out your rules, what sort of approach you might want to take, some tips here, using the active voice, using a second person perspective, using examples, focusing on clarity over complexity, and so on. Then goes on to talk about playtesting. Now, I have previously written a whole book about playtesting, so I don't want to cover the same ground here. So I've taken a particular focus here on playtesters and what we're looking for from playtesters, what makes a good playtester. And so that's what this chapter covers in the book Getting Published. Chapter 13 is when is a game ready? How do you know when it's ready to start pitching to publishers? And so I've given you some guidance on that. How many tests do you need to know? What sort of feedback are you looking for? Chapter 14 is one of the most common questions that I get asked. I get asked this all the time about protecting your idea. What do we need to do with regards to patents and trademarks and copyright and so on? And so I've gone into a little bit more detail on that in this book than I have in my previous books, because I think it's particularly relevant here. So I think, although I'm not a lawyer, everything you really need to know about copyright and trademark and patents is in this book, and non-disclosure agreements. And largely the advice is most of this stuff doesn't protect you very much as a board game designer, and we work much more based on trust and relationships and sharing information so that we can, prove that we were the first people to come up with that. And even if that doesn't have a legal standing, it does protect us in the sort of community's eyes. People will come out in force to help you as a board game designer if they feel that you've been ripped off in some way. So there's a whole chapter about that approach, and then we move on to part 3. Now this is the crux of it. This is where we really get going on the industry stuff. Pitching to publishers. Choosing the right publisher. How do we decide who to approach? So I talk about enthusiasm, scale, the track record of the publisher, the geographic reach, contractual considerations, insight from other designers who have worked with those publishers before. Chapter 16 is about how to make contact with the publishers. So how do we actually approach them, either in person or with an unsolicited email, using online forms, or maybe the publisher becomes aware of you and your game through some other route. And so we talk about that a little bit in the book as well. I even give you a framework for the email that I would write if I was sending an unsolicited email. And I go into quite a lot of detail over the next couple of chapters about sell sheets. So that's like a single page promotional material about your game. So there's an example of a sell sheet here for one of my games. And then it leads into a chapter about sizzle reels, brief videos that promote your game to publishers. And these are almost a requirement at this point in 2025 for publishers. So we talk about how to build a script for that, how to film it, what equipment you need, and the truth is it's not expensive, right? We're not looking for Steven Spielberg here, we're looking for something really quite simple that just gets your message across. Chapter 19 is about conventions and trade fairs, which ones to look out for, how to attend those conventions and trade fairs. There's a whole list of different conventions and trade fairs around the world, the attendance on them, how long they go on for, when they take place, and tips about which ones might be worth attending as a designer. Chapter 20 is about the perfect pitch. So this is an approach to take when pitching to publishers. It describes lots of hints and tips along those lines, how to approach those, whether they're in person or virtual pitches. It's got a whole section in here which is based off of one of my old videos. It was a really popular video a few years ago on the channel where I did a sort of a sketch. I did a really bad pitch. Okay, it was how not to pitch, okay? And so we've got the script of that here, but I've also provided what wasn't in that video, a commentary on what I think the designer was doing wrong and how I think they might have been able to approach it differently. So I think that's a fun chapter, a bit of a change of pace in the middle of the book there. And then we go on to virtual pitching, as I already said. You know, what changes do we need to make if we're pitching online through a computer as opposed to pitching in person? What are the benefits? What are the downsides of virtual pitching? Chapter 22 is how to follow up with publishers once you've made those pitches. What point is appropriate for you to contact them again? What sort of things should you be asking? And of course, that leads us into a chapter on rejection, because you're going to get a lot of rejection. You're going to have to. It's inevitable. You're going to be contacting publishers again and again and again before you find somebody who's interested. That's just normal. That's gone on for generations. That's gone on with, you know, Monopoly and Cluedo and Scrabble, and every popular game throughout history has been rejected over and over again before they find somebody who's willing to take it on. So this is, I think this chapter is... There's quite a lot of, I hesitate to call it psychology because I'm not a psychologist, okay? But there are tips about how to deal with it, how to deal with the feelings, the emotions related to rejection, based on my experience, having experienced a lot of rejection in this industry and in other industries. I was an actor in the past and had to face a lot of rejection in that industry as well. Chapter 24 is about building industry relationships. So how to build and maintain relationships with publishers, not just publishers though. It could also be with other industry professionals. And then it goes on to game design events and contests, which can be a really good way of starting to build those relationships outside of pitch meetings. So it talks about approaching those. It gives some examples of people who have won competitions and then gone on to have very successful published games and very successful careers in the industry, just having won a game competition. Part 4 of the book looks at licensing agreements. So this lays out the sort of terms that you might see in a licensing contract. Based on I've signed many contracts and I've also rejected a number of contracts because I wasn't happy with the terms, and I've adjusted contracts. I've negotiated contracts along the way to make sure the terms were suitable for me. So there's a chapter on creative control. It gives details of the sort of clauses you might see commonly and then talks about what that clause means, where you might like to make changes and so on. So who has creative control? How do you hold on to creative control if you want to? How much do you have to sign over to a publisher? We then go on to talk about getting paid. What can you expect to get paid? How is that going to be approached by the publisher and by yourself? And things to look out for. What's reasonable and what isn't? It goes on to talking about how you get paid for digital editions of your games, sub-licensed editions, international editions, and so on as well. What can you expect by way of an advance payment? What's reasonable? The next chapter is about expansions and derivative works, and again it looks at contractual clauses. How would you be treated if you wanted to make an expansion to your game? What rights do you have in that regard? Derivative works of course means sequels and related games. Getting your rights back is a really important aspect of a contract, making sure that you're not signing your game away forever, okay, but you're able to get your rights back. At some point the contract's going to terminate and you're going to want to be sure that you can then sell that game to somebody else in the future, should you want to. Chapter 31 is about your responsibility to a publisher. What's expected of you once you've signed that contract? How much additional work are you willing to take on? And what can be negotiated in that regard? And then the next chapter is what happens next. So you've signed a contract. What communications are you going to have with a publisher after that? And what are the various events that you're going to be involved in as a designer once you've signed that contract? And there's a surprising amount. It's not the end of the story, signing a contract. There's a surprising amount that happens after that event. All of this is with examples from my own experience, my own games, and it leads us to, of course, the conclusion where I summarize what we've done. Basically, this is some frequently asked questions, revisiting some of the stuff that's in the book, but summarizing all the most common questions that I get asked as a board game designer. So that is Adam in Wales Getting Published, available now on Amazon, both as a physical paperback. Anywhere in the world where there is an Amazon, you can purchase this because it is a print-on-demand product. You can also purchase it as a Kindle ebook. Okay, so you can download an ebook version of it if you don't want a physical copy. And this, as I say, is the 4th book in my series that also includes Adam in Wales playtesting Adam in Wales Product Design, and the Adam in Wales Board Game Designer Journal. So if you've enjoyed any of those books, then you're going to enjoy Getting Published as well. And I would ask you, please leave me an Amazon review. If you read the book, leave me an Amazon review. Let me know what you thought of it. It's so important. It makes such a difference to me because that's the way that Amazon works, right? It needs reviews in order for the algorithm to show this book to other people. And it's the only way I can keep on making content like this, is if people are reading the book, people are seeing the book, and that's because of reviews from people like you. So please do go on and do that. And also for the other books, if you've read them in the past, I'd love it if you left me a review. Thank you so much for watching, for listening. I hope you find this useful. I really think this could be the path to getting your game to market. And if you want to explore any of these topics in more detail, there are videos on practically every topic related to board game design. If you just search back through the back catalogue on this channel, you're going to find answers to the questions that you have. Thanks very much for watching. All the best.